Welcome back. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more powerful untold stories from Africa and beyond. New York City. Inside the towering halls of the United Nations, leaders from across the globe gather beneath the cold blue flag of the world. This is where small nations are often silenced, where power speaks louder than justice. And on this day, the target was Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. As he approached the podium, the whispers were already swirling. Some called him the boy soldier. Others muttered, a loud voice from a powerless land. The humiliation came swift and sharp. His time was cut short. His microphone flickered. His message, a challenge to global hypocrisy, was swallowed by the silence of those who refused to hear. The cameras captured it. A young African leader standing proud, yet mocked, dismissed, and ignored. Around him, diplomats smirked. Reporters typed their headlines. Even some African leaders lowered their eyes, unwilling to share in his shame. It was meant to be the end of him, a public stripping of dignity on the world stage. But humiliation does not always destroy. Sometimes it ignites, and what Ibrahim Traoré did next would not only silence the laughter, it would shock the entire world. The humiliation at the United Nations was not born in a single moment. It had been prepared long before Traoré's feet touched the marble floors of New York. To understand that silence, that deliberate cutting of his microphone, one must first understand the weight pressing on Burkina Faso, a nation strangled not by its soil, but by the invisible hands of power. Burkina Faso was landlocked, a scar of borders carved by colonial rulers who never cared for the rivers, the people, or the mountains. For decades, the country was fed promises, loans that turned into chains, aid that never came without conditions, and partnerships that only served to strip the land of gold while its people remained hungry. The International Monetary Fund had long treated Burkina Faso like a pawn in its vast chessboard of economics. Numbers on paper, policies crafted in boardrooms oceans away, determined whether farmers ate or starved. Villages depended on rain, but even rain was not enough when grain was exported while children's bellies shrank. And so, when Ibrahim Traoré, a man barely in his 30s, seized power, the world laughed. They said too young, too reckless, too naive, but his people did not laugh. His people, weary of empty bellies and hollow promises, looked at him and saw a spark they had not seen in decades. The shadow of Thomas Sankara hung heavily over the land. Sankara, the revolutionary who once dared to rename Upper Volta as Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. Sankara, who rejected Western aid, who planted millions of trees, who demanded Africa stand tall. Sankara, murdered by betrayal, silenced before his dream could rise. Every step Traoré took was measured against that ghost. Was he the second coming of Sankara, or just another soldier who would trade ideals for survival? The answer was not yet clear, but the world's powers had already decided. He would be tested, humiliated, broken before he could become a symbol, and so the threats began. Letters arrived at his office, carefully worded, diplomatic, but sharp as knives. From Paris came a warning: do not challenge French mining contracts or aid will vanish. From Washington, a reminder: your country depends on global goodwill. Do not stray too far. From Europe, whispers of sanctions if he dared to walk his own path. Behind these messages were promises too. Offers of wealth, personal power, even exile in comfort, if he bent his knee. The very offers that countless leaders before him had accepted. But Traoré remained silent. What the world did not see was the isolation it brought. His own advisors questioned him. His cabinet split in whispers. Even within the army, loyalty was not certain. 3 figures, seasoned generals, older, veterans of foreign academies, sat in smoky rooms and asked the same question: how long will this boy last? The stage was being prepared for New York, for the great hall where the world would laugh. But before that humiliation came the suffering at home. Burkina Faso was bleeding. In the north, rebels with foreign weapons prowled villages, driving families into the dust. In the markets, mothers stood with coins too small to buy bread. Schools stood half empty as children were forced to work in the fields. Soldiers muttered of empty salaries, of weapons that never arrived, of fighting a war no one seemed willing to win. The young leader carried it all on his shoulders. His speeches to his people were fiery, yes, full of courage. But in the silence of his quarters, under the dim glow of a single lamp, the weight showed. His hands traced maps of his country, lines of villages fallen to insurgency, rivers drying, mines stripped bare. And though his face rarely betrayed it, his eyes carried despair. Still, he stood, because he knew something the world had forgotten. When a people have nothing left to lose, they can no longer be broken. And so when the invitation came for him to speak at the United Nations, he saw more than an obligation. He saw a chance, not just to speak, but to scream. Not just to represent Burkina Faso, but to remind the world that Africa was not a collection of silent pawns. The powers knew it too, and they prepared their humiliation. His speech was scheduled at the very end, when most leaders had already left the hall. His time was cut to minutes. His microphone, controlled by unseen technicians, was at the mercy of those who wished him silenced. Reporters were briefed in advance. A firebrand. A boy in uniform, but nothing more. And so, when the day came, he stood before the assembly. The flags of the world towered behind him. The cameras flickered red. The eyes of thousands pierced into him, some with mockery, some with indifference, some with quiet hope. What followed would humiliate him. But humiliation was only the surface. Underneath, in silence, something deeper was stirring, something even his enemies could not see. Because while the world mocked Ibrahim Traoré, his people, watching from dusty villages, crowded markets, and flickering television sets, saw something else entirely. They saw themselves. The humiliation in New York was the explosion. But the fuse had been burning long before. For months leading up to that speech, Traoré's presence on the world stage had been quietly sabotaged. Invitations to international forums were delayed. Security clearances for his team were lost. Even his travel arrangements were tampered with. Planes diverted, routes questioned, as though to remind him he was not a leader of equals, but a guest in someone else's empire. Every detail was a calculated gesture, a reminder that the world did not see Burkina Faso as sovereign, but as small, weak, and disposable. And yet, back home, hope clung stubbornly. Burkina farmers listened on dusty radios, whispering that their president would speak for them, that he would tell the world of their hunger, of their forgotten suffering. Soldiers at the front carried pocket radios, waiting for his words like a weapon stronger than the rifles in their hands. Mothers with children in their arms prayed that this time, the world might finally hear. But behind those prayers, shadows were moving. The three generals, men who had fought wars before Traoré was even a boy, began meeting in hidden chambers. They had trained in Paris, in Washington, in Dakar. They had dined with diplomats, shaken hands with CEOs of mining firms, and knew well how the world worked. To them, Traoré was dangerous not because of his failures, but because of his refusal to bend. Too young, one spat. Too reckless, said another. But what they meant was something deeper, too uncontrollable. And so they watched with cold eyes as he prepared for New York. They heard his drafts, his fiery condemnations, his bold calls for Africa to rise. They knew what he intended to say, and they knew it could not be allowed, but they did not need to silence him with bullets. They only needed to ensure the world laughed when he spoke, and laugh they did. In the assembly hall, the betrayal unfolded as if choreographed. The timekeeper tapped his watch after just a few minutes. The technicians lowered his microphone until his words barely carried. Delegates checked their phones, whispered, shuffled papers. The camera feeds cut away mid-sentence. To the watching world, it was humiliation. A leader ignored, stripped of dignity on the grandest stage. To his enemies, it was victory. For if Africa's rising voice could be mocked into silence, then the dream would die before it lived. Yet outside the marble halls of New York, the humiliation carried a different weight. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in front of flickering televisions. They saw their leader's microphone silenced. They saw the smirks, the whispers, the indifference of powerful men. And though pain filled their chests, something else burned alongside it. Anger. Anger that their land, their lives, their suffering had been reduced to silence. Anger that when their voice finally reached the world, it was choked in the throat. Anger that even now, in the 21st century, an African leader could be treated not as an equal, but as a child scolded in public. This anger began to spread like fire. Not just in Burkina Faso, but in Mali, in Niger, in Ghana, in South Africa. Clips of the humiliation were shared online, edited, remixed, replayed with captions that screamed betrayal. They do not want to hear us. They fear the truth of Africa. Traoré, silent in his hotel room that night, watched it all. His face was calm, but his fists were clenched. His advisors spoke nervously, some urging retreat, others advising a softer tone next time. But he said little. He simply stared at the television, at the image of himself standing muted in the great hall of nations, and whispered only once, "Never again." That was the moment the seed of his comeback was planted. But the path ahead was not simple. His humiliation had emboldened enemies at home. The three generals saw weakness, smelled blood. Whispers of betrayal grew louder. If the world did not respect him, why should his army? If he could be laughed at in New York, why should his generals obey him in Ouagadougou? For days, rumors swirled of plots. Convoys of soldiers were seen moving at odd hours. Weapons shipments went missing. Messages were intercepted. Foreign embassies speaking too eagerly with men who were not the president. The humiliation was not just a blow to dignity. It was the opening of a door, a signal to his enemies. Now is the time to strike. Yet even as plots swirled, something else was happening. Ordinary people began to rally behind him, not because of his speech, but because of his silence. Because they had seen with their own eyes how the world treated their leader. And in that humiliation, they saw their own reflection, the centuries of Africa being mocked, ignored, silenced. His suffering was theirs, his silence was theirs, and so they waited for his next move, for his voice to return, because they knew, as he knew, that the world had mistaken humiliation for defeat. But for Africa, humiliation had always been the beginning of fire, and that fire was about to burn. The days after New York were heavy with silence, but that silence was loud. Every headline seemed designed to crush him. International media painted him as a naive soldier masquerading as a statesman. Pundits questioned his intelligence, his experience, his legitimacy. A boy in uniform, they wrote, a flash in Africa's pan. Each article, each broadcast felt like a hammer striking the chest of Burkina Faso. Back home, the people felt the weight immediately. Markets grew quieter. Traders whispered fearfully. Farmers looked to the skies, wondering if aid would come before famine. Mothers clutched their children tighter, aware that the world's mockery had direct consequences for their families. Even his allies began to falter. Some in his cabinet whispered about compromise, about appeasing foreign powers, about keeping the peace. Yet at night, when the city slept and the moon hung over Ouagadougou like a silent witness, Traoré moved in solitude. He traced the paths of history, mapping not only his nation, but the chains of injustice that had held Africa down for centuries. The three generals, sensing vulnerability, began to act. They met in secret, often in shadowed warehouses on the outskirts of the city. Their conversations were quiet but urgent. One spoke of securing foreign support, another of creating narratives to discredit Traoré domestically. They did not need to strike immediately. They only needed time, and the world's laughter in New York had given them all the time they needed. Meanwhile, foreign powers tightened invisible nooses around the country. Sanctions whispered through corridors of power in Europe, subtle but stifling. A shipment of fertilizer was delayed. Loans for hospitals disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Every slight seemed minor, but together they formed a relentless pressure designed to bend Traoré's will. But he did not bend. Instead, he began to move, quietly, meticulously. He gathered trusted advisors, scholars, and diplomats, men and women who knew the intricacies of both African geopolitics and global perception. He instructed them to collect evidence of corruption, exploitation, and hypocrisy. He wanted not a battle fought with rifles, but one fought with truth. At night, he walked the streets. He listened to his people. Soldiers spoke of empty coffers. Mothers spoke of hunger. Children spoke of dreams they were too afraid to dream. Every word was absorbed, every story recorded, and every injustice was etched into the blueprint of his plan. What the world saw as a humiliated, silenced man was, in reality, a leader preparing for the stage no one expected, and in the shadows, the generals noticed. Their spies reported movements, but the more they watched, the less they understood. Traoré's silence was not weakness. It was a strategy, a calm before the storm. The next months were a crucible. The international community continued its ridicule. Editorial cartoons mocked his uniform. Diplomatic cables questioned his sanity. Conferences ignored him. Every insult, every dismissal was a test, a fire through which he would emerge stronger. Back home, the suffering deepened. Rebel groups, emboldened by the perception of weakness, attacked villages along the northern border. Families fled under the cover of night, carrying only what they could. Hunger spread. Mothers sang lullabies of survival instead of joy. Farmers abandoned fields when no markets were open to receive their crops. Soldiers' morale fractured. They asked themselves questions they had never imagined. If our leader is powerless on the world stage, what power does he have over our lives? If he cannot command respect internationally, can he command it at home? Traoré faced these doubts with quiet resolve. Every report of famine, every whisper of rebellion became a piece of the puzzle. He began designing a campaign unlike anything the world had seen. A narrative that would not merely respond to mockery, but would redefine it entirely. He sent envoys to neighboring nations, discreetly building alliances. He commissioned secret broadcasts, highlighting Burkina Faso's resilience and the hypocrisy of global powers. He reached out to African youth leaders, students, and civil activists, encouraging them to document, report, and share stories of truth. Even within the general circles, cracks appeared. Some began to question their own motives. Were they truly serving the country, or merely their ambition and fear of a young man refusing to submit? Their uncertainty was Traoré's ally. The tension was almost unbearable. Every meeting at the UN, every international broadcast, every shipment of delayed aid reminded him of the stakes. One wrong move could ignite rebellion, collapse the economy, or destroy his credibility. Yet paradoxically, every threat also sharpened his vision. He devised his comeback as a masterstroke of optics and substance. It would not be merely a speech. It would be an unveiling of Africa's truth, a confrontation with hypocrisy, and a showcase of courage. The generals, the diplomats, the pundits, all were unwitting participants in a drama they did not understand. At night, he reviewed footage of his New York speech. Every smirk, every rolled eye, every whisper became a note in his symphony of strategy. He knew exactly who needed to be confronted, who could be won over, and who would crumble before the undeniable force of conviction. Meanwhile, ordinary people became messengers. Viral videos of his humiliation began circulating on social media, but framed differently this time, as a call to awareness, a rallying cry. Across Africa, citizens shared the footage not to mock him, but to question why such a leader could be silenced, why their voices were diminished. The tension was reaching its peak. The generals plotted. Foreign powers applied subtle pressures. The people waited, and Traoré prepared, not for revenge, but for truth. The days leading to the final stage of his comeback were almost unbearable. Every whisper of dissent, every report of famine, every act of sabotage tested him. He moved like a shadow through Ouagadougou, meeting advisors in secret rooms, reviewing reports of rebel activity, tracking international news. He was everywhere and nowhere, a constant presence in the lives of those who needed him most. At the UN, preparations were underway for another session. Leaders had anticipated a quiet, apologetic speech. They had not anticipated strategy, intellect, and a fiery resolve. He would enter the hall again, but this time, he would not be silenced. Inside Burkina Faso, the people felt a shift. Teachers paused lessons to speak of courage. Shopkeepers discussed the possibility that their leader could reclaim dignity. Soldiers spoke with renewed determination, inspired by the quiet, methodical actions of a president who refused to be broken. And still, the generals worked. Their plans, designed to exploit perceived weakness, began to falter. One faction even began leaking information that undermined the other, as if the universe itself was conspiring to aid Traoré. The tension culminated in a series of quiet confrontations. Envoys from foreign powers attempted to negotiate compromise, offering aid in exchange for public compliance. Traoré listened, nodded, and refused. Every deal became a demonstration of integrity, every polite refusal a declaration that humiliation would not dictate policy. The people's anticipation became a tangible force. They gathered in homes, on streets, in markets, waiting for the moment their leader would reclaim respect. Each broadcast, each message, each whispered hope built a wave that could not be stopped. And then, the night before his return to the UN, Traoré walked alone along the streets of Ouagadougou. He observed the city, quiet, resilient, waiting. He thought of Sankara, of history, of the countless Africans silenced across centuries. He whispered to himself, "This is for them, for Africa, for the truth." In that moment, he became more than a man. He became a symbol, not of power, but of resistance. Not of wealth or armies, but of courage and conviction. The world had mocked him. It had attempted to silence him. It had underestimated him. And yet, as the sun rose over Ouagadougou and New York prepared to witness his return, one undeniable fact remained. Ibrahim Traoré was ready. The stage was set. The actors were in place, and the world, unaware of what was coming, was about to be stunned. The day dawned like a silver blade slicing through the horizon. In Ouagadougou, streets were alive with quiet anticipation. News of Traoré's return to the United Nations had traveled faster than the government intended. Citizens whispered on corners, in markets, in classrooms, even in the back alleys where children played. Today, their leader would rise not just for Burkina Faso, but for the dignity of a continent long silenced. Inside the president's residence, the atmosphere was electric, yet meticulous. Advisors scurried through papers, reviewing schedules, double-checking travel arrangements, and ensuring every detail was perfect. Traoré, however, moved calmly, almost eerily so, as if the humiliation of months past had sharpened him into a blade of precision. He inspected maps of New York, studied the United Nations seating chart, memorized the corridors and angles where cameras would focus, and anticipated the reactions of every diplomat he had faced before. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of a table. The man in the mirror was calm, composed, but the intensity in his eyes burned brighter than any spotlight. The silence around him felt like a drumbeat, echoing with every decision, every strategy, every calculated risk. He had rehearsed, yes, but not just words. He had rehearsed perception, presence, and the invisible art of turning humiliation into triumph. Across the Atlantic, in New York, the UN Assembly was bustling with its usual mix of pomp and pretense. Delegates checked schedules, adjusted ties, whispered updates, and prepared to greet a man they still believed was weak, naive, and malleable. The last humiliation had left a mark, and most assumed the same script would play again. A muted speech, a truncated message, and then the cameras would move on to more important matters. But even before his arrival, subtle tremors of unease began to ripple through the corridors. Diplomatic aides whispered, noticing the sharpness of his planning, the sudden flurry of meetings, the air of controlled determination that seemed to radiate from his team. There was something different this time, something they could not yet articulate. As Traoré's plane touched down, the streets of New York were oblivious to the storm about to enter their world. Airport personnel followed protocols, media photographers snapped routine shots, and security scanned lists without suspicion. Few realized that in that young man's eyes was a history of centuries, a history of Africa silenced, exploited, and mocked. And today, those centuries would demand acknowledgement. He arrived at the UN with minimal entourage. No banners, no fanfare, no signs of spectacle. Just a man walking with measured steps, shoulders squared, and gaze steady. The contrast to his previous visit was immediately noticeable. The whispers began. "He looks different," some muttered. Others scoffed, convinced it was still a child pretending to be a man. Yet even the scoffers felt a subtle tension, a prickling sense that something had changed. In the assembly hall, the ritual began. Delegates shuffled into seats, checked phones, adjusted microphones, and whispered assessments. The camera feeds glimmered across continents, capturing every motion with clinical precision. The world was watching, and most expected little. Traoré entered with the quiet dignity of a man whose silence had been forged into a weapon. His steps echoed in the hall like measured drumbeats, marking the rhythm of anticipation. Eyes followed him. Cameras zoomed. Whispers passed through the aisles. He walked past diplomats who had mocked him, past aides who had underestimated him, and past journalists who had written him off. And yet he did not rush. Each step was deliberate, each movement a statement. He did not speak yet, but the air seemed to tighten around him. He approached the podium. The microphone was active, yet this time no one dared to cut him short. The technicians and aides who had once silenced him sensed the weight of history pressing down. The young African leader adjusted papers, took a breath, and glanced once at the flags behind him, the blue UN banner and the small, resilient flag of Burkina Faso. The juxtaposition was stark, the world above, his people below, and the bridge between them, him. As he lifted his eyes to the assembly, the silence became almost unbearable. The whispers died. Phones were lowered. Cameras focused. Traoré had transformed the hall with the gravity of presence alone. In that moment, it was not a man speaking. It was the voice of an entire continent, long ignored, long humiliated, finally demanding recognition. The generals back home, who had once plotted his downfall, watched the live feed in disbelief. Their plans of subversion and manipulation had been rendered irrelevant by the precision, patience, and calculated preparation of their supposed target. What they had expected to be a limp apology was now an ominous calm before an eruption they could not yet measure. Traoré's pulse was steady. His mind worked with laser focus. Every insult, every slight, every whispered doubt of the past months was catalogued. Every word he would utter, every pause he would take, every subtle shift of gaze or gesture was designed to turn the world's mockery into a mirror, reflecting its own hypocrisy. And then, almost imperceptibly, he began. The first words were soft, deliberate, almost conversational, but beneath them ran a current of fire. The assembly leaned in. Diplomats who had scoffed now straightened in their chairs. Reporters who had prepared headlines of ridicule paused, pens and fingers frozen. Traoré spoke not only of Burkina Faso, but of the countless nations whose dignity had been diminished by policies crafted in distant offices, whose voices had been silenced by the pretense of diplomacy. The pace was methodical, almost cinematic. Each sentence revealed a truth the world could not ignore: the exploitation, the hypocrisy, the centuries of underestimation. And with each revelation, the smirks faded. Eyes widened. Murmurs of disbelief spread through the hall. Some delegates looked at one another, uncertain whether to intervene, to whisper, or to sit frozen. Traoré's presence was more than physical. It was symbolic. Every gesture, every pause, every word resonated across continents. The people of Burkina Faso watched with tears in their eyes, seeing the humiliation of months transmuted into undeniable authority. Across Africa, youth and elders alike leaned into their screens, sensing a shift in history. And yet, he did not raise his voice. He did not shout. He did not demand attention. Instead, he let the weight of truth, the burden of centuries, and the undeniable logic of dignity carry the room. Those who had expected a faint, apologetic voice now found themselves leaning forward, caught in the magnetic pull of a leader who had been underestimated, silenced, and scorned, and had risen anyway. The silence in the assembly was profound. It was a heavy, almost tangible hush, a pause in the machinery of global power. Every chair creaked slightly as delegates leaned forward, some in curiosity, others in dread. Cameras focused on Traoré with unblinking precision, capturing each deliberate gesture, each subtle inflection. Even those who had written him off could feel that something extraordinary was unfolding. Traoré's voice, calm but piercing, began to echo through the grand hall. He did not merely speak. He narrated the story of a continent's history, of centuries stolen, of resources plundered, of voices muted. He spoke of Burkina Faso, the land, the people, the enduring spirit. And in his words, every African nation could see a reflection of its own struggles. At first, some delegates shifted uncomfortably. They were trained to interrupt, to dismiss, to counter, but the cadence of his speech, the precision of every fact, every statistic, every historical reference, made interruption impossible. His words were not accusations, they were mirrors. Each revelation struck like lightning in the minds of those who had believed themselves untouchable. He recounted the exploitation of African resources under the guise of aid and diplomacy. The cycles of famine and debt imposed by powers that called themselves protectors. Each phrase peeled back layers of pretense, exposing hypocrisy with surgical clarity. Journalists scribbled frantically, some in disbelief, some silently nodding at truths long buried. The cameras captured every reaction, every twitch, every widening eye. In the front rows, the diplomats who had once smiled at his humiliation now sat rigid. The Western envoy shifted uncomfortably, the papers in hand trembling ever so slightly. A renowned African diplomat, who had privately doubted him, looked down, realizing that the young leader's words carried not only courage but undeniable authority. Across the room, aides whispered to each other, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Traoré paused. Not long, just a heartbeat, enough to let the weight of the previous statement sink in. He let the silence speak. In that silence, the room felt the centuries of dismissed voices. The mothers who had cried for their children. The farmers who had tilled the soil in vain. The soldiers who had fought and doubted. And then he shifted, not in anger, but in power. His words became sharper, more cutting, but delivered with measured precision. He named the systemic injustices, highlighted the contradictions of promises versus reality, and revealed the hidden pressures placed upon small nations like Burkina Faso. The names of policies, corporations, and foreign interventions were mentioned, not in accusation alone, but in a careful, undeniable record of truth. The assembly reacted. Some gasped quietly, others leaned forward, gripping their desks. Cameras caught whispered consultations, flashes of panic, eyes darting to colleagues. A few delegates attempted to murmur responses, but the floor was under his command. He did not need to raise his voice. The clarity of fact, the authority of presence, the gravity of history, all carried the room. Outside the hall, in Burkina Faso, the nation held its breath. Screens in Ouagadougou flickered with his image. Crowds formed spontaneously, streets crowded with people who had waited for this moment, this vindication. Mothers wept openly, seeing their leader turn humiliation into a weapon of truth. Soldiers, once uncertain, now felt a surge of pride, a renewed loyalty forged in the crucible of international defiance. Even the generals who had plotted his downfall at home watched silently, caught off guard by the brilliance of the execution. Every strategic move they had planned, every assumption about weakness, crumbled under the weight of Traoré's preparation. Their whispers of dissent dissolved into awe. Traoré's words now touched something deeper. Beyond facts, beyond history, beyond politics, he spoke of dignity, of the unbroken spirit of Africa. Every pause, every glance, every deliberate inflection drew the room further into his narrative. Delegates felt the moral weight of their positions. Journalists felt the ethical consequences of their previous mockery. Even skeptics could not ignore the undeniable force of a man who had been humiliated, yet remained unbroken. At the midpoint of his speech, Traoré did something unexpected. He did not merely recount injustice. He framed it as a challenge. A call to the assembly, to the world. How long will power silence truth? How long will history be rewritten by those who claim authority over the weak? How long will Africa's dignity be measured in footnotes and reports? The silence was electric. Some delegates held their breath. Others looked away, uncomfortable at being confronted not with rhetoric, but with undeniable fact and moral clarity. The tension was palpable, stretching across the room like a taut wire. And then, with a subtle shift of tone, Traoré's speech began to weave hope into the narrative of suffering. He spoke of resilience, of courage, of the small victories of ordinary people, the farmers who refused to abandon their lands, the mothers who refused despair, the soldiers who found loyalty in honor rather than fear. He framed these stories not as anomalies, but as evidence that Africa's strength was inherent, waiting only for recognition, for a voice brave enough to speak it into the world. Every eye in the assembly was now fixed. Cameras captured the reactions of ambassadors who had once dismissed him. Some shifted uneasily in their seats, others exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing a moment that transcended protocol and hierarchy. His presence and words were rewriting expectations in real time. The journalists, some who had anticipated ridicule, now scribbled notes furiously. Their headlines, once prepared to mock, were already transforming in their minds. Social media outside the hall buzzed with fragments of his speech, snippets that carried a viral energy. Africa will not be silenced. A continent rises through dignity. The boy soldier silenced becomes the voice the world cannot ignore. Traoré paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. In that pregnant moment, the room was suspended. Time seemed to slow. Every whisper, every shuffling foot, every inhalation of the delegates was caught in the gravity of the moment. He had turned humiliation into anticipation, mockery into tension, and the world's underestimation into awe. And then, in the final segment of Part 2, he began to pivot. The narrative shifted from recounting the past and exposing hypocrisy to projecting a vision of what could be, a unified, dignified Africa standing with its head held high. A continent whose leaders and people were no longer to be mocked or silenced, but to be recognized as equals. His language was poetic, almost cinematic, each word designed to resonate long after the cameras stopped rolling. The murmurs that had once accompanied his previous appearance were gone. Every listener, every viewer, every reporter was now caught in the gravity of a leader who had been humiliated, underestimated, and mocked, and had turned every element of that humiliation into unstoppable momentum. The room had changed. The UN Assembly, once a theater of dismissal, had become a stage of revelation. Delegates who had scoffed now sat frozen, unsure how to respond. The journalists who had planned to mock scrambled to keep pace with the weight of every word. Cameras zoomed, capturing every nuance, every pause, every intentional shift in posture. The world, watching through screens across continents, was witnessing something rare, a humiliation transformed into triumph before their very eyes. Traoré's voice carried a quiet ferocity, a controlled storm. He did not shout, he did not demand. Instead, he let the logic of truth and the weight of justice guide every sentence. He traced the web of injustice from centuries past to the present, highlighting the systems that had allowed Africa to be silenced, exploited, and overlooked. He named hypocrisy where it existed, exposed exploitation where it flourished, and honored resilience where it persisted. As he spoke, delegates shifted uncomfortably. Some had imagined arguments, rebuttals, polite dismissals. None were prepared for clarity, courage, and undeniable moral authority wrapped in the calm presence of a leader who had endured humiliation and emerged unbroken. The generals back home who had once plotted in secret now watched helplessly. Every calculated move of theirs had been anticipated, every assumption dismantled. Their confidence crumbled not with force but with precision, with the undeniable proof that true leadership was forged not in fear but in unwavering resolve. Traoré paused. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Every camera captured the moment. A young man alone at a podium, commanding the attention of the most powerful figures in the world with nothing but presence and truth. And then, with the gravity of a man who knew the history of an entire continent rested on his shoulders, he delivered the lines that would be replayed for decades. We are not shadows to be overlooked. We are not pawns to be traded. We are Africa, upright, unbroken, undeniable. Our history, our suffering, our triumphs, they are ours to tell, ours to shape, ours to defend. And today, no microphone, no snicker, no subtle dismissal will silence the truth of who we are. The effect was immediate. Delegates gasped. Some whispered frantically to colleagues. The Western envoys, who had once smirked at his first appearance, now sat rigid, staring with a mixture of shock and awe. African diplomats in the hall straightened in their chairs, tears brimming in eyes that had long endured disregard and condescension. Outside the hall, Burkina Faso erupted in celebration. In Ouagadougou, streets were alive with people shouting in unison, waving flags, and dancing not merely in joy, but in vindication. Across Africa, social media exploded with fragments of his speech, hashtags trending within minutes. Africa rises, Traoré triumphs, voice unbroken. The humiliation that had once seemed like defeat had become a rallying cry for an entire continent. Inside the hall, the tension between silence and awe was palpable. Traoré leaned slightly forward, eyes scanning the room. He did not need to raise his voice. The intensity of his gaze, the deliberate pacing of every word, was sufficient. And then he pivoted, from recounting injustice to projecting a vision of possibility. "Imagine an Africa," he said softly, "where dignity is not optional, where every child can dream, where every leader answers to the people, not to distant powers. Imagine a continent that cannot be silenced, that cannot be mocked, that will no longer bow to the pretense of authority that does not see us as equals. That Africa is not a dream, it is a right. And it begins now." The room was stunned into silence. Even seasoned diplomats, trained to control reactions, found themselves leaning forward, caught in the current of conviction that flowed through every syllable. His words were not mere rhetoric. They were a declaration, a defiance, a reshaping of the world's understanding in real time. And then came the final blow, subtle yet devastating. Traoré presented evidence, carefully documented, indisputable, of past manipulations, broken promises, and policies that had systematically undermined African nations. The photographs, memos, and official communications appeared on screens behind him, juxtaposed with the courage and resilience of Burkina Faso's people. It was a revelation crafted not for anger, but for undeniable clarity, delegates murmured. Phones clicked. Reporters whispered into headsets. The generals back home sat frozen, realizing that any move against Traoré now would be seen not as strategy, but as betrayal in the public eye. Every attempt to undermine him had been anticipated. Every potential humiliation had been inverted. The young leader who had been silenced had turned every weapon aimed at him into proof of his authority. And in that moment, the world understood. This was not just a speech. It was a masterclass in courage, strategy, and moral authority. It was a transformation of humiliation into triumph, a rebuke of those who underestimated him, and an inspiration to millions who had ever been dismissed, ignored or silenced. Traoré concluded not with a plea, not with a demand, but with a question that hung in the air like a challenge to every nation represented. How long will the voices of the oppressed be ignored? How long will history be written by those who dismiss the dignity of entire continents? The time has come for Africa to stand, upright, unbroken, undeniable. Are you ready to witness it? The room erupted. Not with chaos, but with stunned acknowledgement. Delegates, reporters, and diplomats all realized that the narrative had shifted irreversibly. The young leader who had been humiliated had not only reclaimed his dignity, he had redefined the way the world perceived an entire continent. Outside, the people celebrated. Across Africa, hope surged through cities, villages, and towns alike. The moment was no longer just about a single man. It was about collective pride, about a continent daring to believe in itself. The humiliation had been transformed into triumph, the laughter into awe, the doubt into undeniable respect. Traoré stepped back from the podium. His mission was complete. He had turned silence into resonance, mockery into validation, humiliation into a world-shaking declaration. And though the cameras would eventually fade, the message would endure. Africa could no longer be ignored, silenced, or diminished. Its voice, through leaders like him, had arrived. The world had witnessed a moment few thought possible. A young African leader, once silenced, had transformed humiliation into triumph. But the story did not end with applause or headlines. The real impact was deeper, subtler, and infinitely more profound. In the days following the UN speech, Burkina Faso awoke to a new reality. Streets that had been tense with anxiety now thrummed with pride and cautious joy. Markets reopened with renewed energy, not simply for commerce, but as symbols of resilience. Children went to school carrying not only books, but a sense of possibility, inspired by a leader who refused to bow to mockery. Soldiers marched with their heads high, loyalty reinforced not by fear, but by admiration. Mothers who had once feared for the lives of their children now whispered stories of courage, recounting the speech that had shaken the world and restored hope. The generals who had once plotted against Traoré found themselves cornered. Their plans of subversion had crumbled under the weight of public perception. The international media, previously eager to dissect and mock, now scrutinized their actions, documenting every misstep and hesitation. Internal dissent within their ranks grew, for soldiers and officers now questioned the motives of men who had underestimated their own leader. Some generals attempted quiet damage control, issuing vague statements of loyalty, but the damage had been done. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. Internationally, the ripple effects were immediate and profound. Diplomats, analysts, and pundits struggled to reframe their narratives. The young man they had once dismissed now stood as a symbol of strategy, courage, and moral clarity. Headlines transformed almost overnight. From humiliation to triumph, Traoré redefines African leadership. A voice Africa can no longer ignore. The leader who silenced the world's doubts. Social media exploded with video clips, translated captions and hashtags that surged across continents. Traoré triumphs, Africa rises, voice unbroken. Even the IMF, which had exerted subtle pressures on Burkina Faso for months, felt the tremors of change. Policies designed to humiliate or bend the nation suddenly appeared small, petty, and irrelevant in the face of Traoré's moral authority. Their reports and projections were scrutinized, criticized, and challenged by a world now watching more closely. The balance of perception had shifted. A small nation, led with courage, could influence the global narrative. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's return was met with celebrations tempered by reflection. He did not parade through the streets in triumph, but walked quietly among his people. He visited schools, hospitals, and markets. Each interaction was not ceremonial, but personal, a reaffirmation that leadership was rooted in presence, empathy, and accountability. Children ran to him, touching his uniform, asking questions. Mothers shared stories of survival. Farmers spoke of fields untended. Soldiers recounted doubts that had been silenced by his example. Every interaction deepened the bond between leader and people, reinforcing the trust and admiration that had fueled the comeback. The impact extended beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, leaders, students, and ordinary citizens felt the spark of inspiration. He had shown that a single, unwavering voice could challenge global power structures, expose hypocrisy, and transform humiliation into a catalyst for pride. Discussions ignited in classrooms, cafes, and online forums. Youth leaders debated policy, activists organized movements, and communities spoke openly about dignity, sovereignty, and self-determination. Traoré's strategy had been more than a speech. It was a demonstration of what leadership could accomplish when rooted in courage, intelligence, and the will of the people. Humiliation had been transmuted into influence. Ridicule had become authority, and the world could not ignore it. Months passed, and the ripple effects continued. The generals who had once plotted in secret either resigned, were reassigned, or found themselves publicly scrutinized. Their power had been dismantled not by force alone, but by the collective perception of a people and a leader whose integrity and courage had made them obsolete. Soldiers who had once questioned Traoré's authority now carried out orders with renewed conviction, inspired by a leader who had faced global humiliation and emerged stronger. Internationally, foreign powers recalibrated their approach. Diplomats approached Burkina Faso with a mix of respect and caution, understanding that the old strategies of manipulation and dismissal would no longer succeed. Traoré's example became a blueprint, a lesson in the power of narrative, morality, and strategic resilience. Conferences, treaties, and negotiations were now conducted with a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement. Burkina Faso, and Africa more broadly, would not be underestimated. The people's trust in Traoré deepened. Ordinary citizens found renewed energy to pursue education, innovation, and community development. Projects long stalled due to fear or bureaucratic inertia were revived. Farmers returned to neglected fields, schools reopened with vigor, and local markets flourished. The economy, once shackled by external pressures and internal uncertainty, began to stabilize. Progress was slow but deliberate, and each step forward carried the weight of a shared triumph. Traoré himself did not rest on his laurels. He worked tirelessly, visiting rural communities, engaging in dialogues with neighboring nations, and fostering partnerships that respected Burkina Faso's sovereignty. His leadership was characterized by humility and diligence, ensuring that the victory at the UN was not a moment of ego, but a catalyst for systemic change. Symbolically, his comeback resonated across Africa. Young leaders saw in Traoré an example that courage could counter cynicism, that preparation and moral clarity could outmaneuver intimidation, and that dignity could never be stolen if it was rooted in conviction. Across cities and villages, discussions emerged about African agency, self-determination, and the reclaiming of narratives historically controlled by external powers. The media, which had once ridiculed him, now framed his story as historic. Documentaries, opinion pieces, and social media campaigns celebrated the audacity of a young leader who had confronted humiliation and emerged victorious. The narrative shifted. What had been a moment of shame became a global lesson in leadership, resilience, and dignity. Traoré's personal transformation was equally profound. The young soldier who had once faced mockery had grown into a symbol, not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's unbroken spirit. He embodied a message that transcended politics, that courage, strategy, and moral clarity could confront injustice at any scale. That even the most overwhelming humiliation could be turned into a platform for triumph. And yet, even in victory, he remained focused. He understood that true change required more than speeches or symbolism. It required action, accountability, and empathy. He invested in education, infrastructure, and healthcare. He fostered dialogue among African nations, encouraging cooperation that prioritized dignity and sovereignty. Every initiative reflected the same principle that had guided him through the humiliation, that leadership was about lifting others, not oneself. The climax of his journey, the UN comeback, became a turning point, not only for his nation, but for a continent. For decades, Africa's potential had been diminished by external narratives, internal corruption, and historical exploitation. Traoré's moment of triumph was proof that a single, prepared, courageous voice could alter perception, inspire action, and restore pride. As the world absorbed the aftermath, the question lingered in the hearts of millions. Could this be the beginning of a new era? A moment when Africa would no longer be silenced, no longer underestimated, and no longer dismissed? Traoré's speech, his strategy, and his unyielding dignity had already begun to answer that question. Across nations, communities, and generations, the message was clear. Africa's voice had returned, and it would not be ignored. In Burkina Faso, celebrations were tempered by resolve. Victory was not in mockery averted or applause received, but in the knowledge that the people now had a leader who had confronted the world's powers and emerged not only unbroken, but empowered. The country had witnessed history, a moment where courage and preparation had rewritten the rules of engagement with global forces. And in that moment, Traoré looked beyond the applause, beyond the headlines, beyond the accolades. He saw the faces of his people, mothers, children, soldiers, elders, and understood the true magnitude of what had been achieved. The humiliation that had once threatened to crush him had instead become a foundation for hope, pride, and collective strength. Is this the moment Africa begins to reclaim its destiny? He wondered, not rhetorically, but as a challenge to the world, to his people, and to himself. Because in that question lay the essence of his journey, a transformation of adversity into power, of silence into resonance, of despair into enduring hope. And the answer, echoing across the continent and the globe, was unmistakable. Yes,